Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. I apologize for the delay. We had some confusion regarding the live session timings. So this is lesson 16 in our course on al-Quduri, and lesson 8 for those who've been attending live. And in this lesson, we are going to be taking 2 chapters of the book. The first is the chapter on the Nawafil Prayers, and then the chapter on the Forgetfulness Prostration. And what we'll be doing for the live session is the 2 chapters that come after this, which is the prayer of the sick person and the prostration of recital. I'll be recording those and putting them up. And so in the next live session, we won't be covering those 2 chapters because the recordings of those will be made available, inshallah. Because I do want to get to Kitab al-Jum'ah and Kitab al-Eidain before Ramadan starts. And so the book of Nawafil, or Supererogatory Prayers. And so Imam al-Quduri begins this text, Bab al-Nawafil, by stating, As-sunnatu fi salati أن يصلي ركعتين بعد طلوع الفجر وأربعا قبل الظهر وركعتين بعدها وأربعا قبل العصر وإن شاء ركعتين وركعتين بعد المغرب وأربعا قبل العشاء وأربعا بعدها وإن شاء ركعتين. So he says that the sunnah in prayer is to perform 2 cycles after the onset of dawn, after Fajr, the time of Fajr enters, 4 cycles before Dhuhr and 2 after it, 4 cycles before Asr, or 2 if one wishes, 2 cycles after Maghrib, and then 4 cycles before the Isha prayer, and 4 after it, or 2 if one wishes. And so a lot of these Nawafil prayers are known to most of us because hopefully, inshallah, we pray them. And if we don't regularly pray them, we at least know from people around us and from what we've been taught as children that these are the sunnah associated with the various prayers. Now, as a quick dive into the evidence, the reason why the ulama have stipulated specific prayers as being sunan, whether highly emphasized or otherwise, is primarily because of this prophetic hadith in the Sunnah of Abi Dawud, where the Prophet ﷺ said that whoever remains persistent on 12 prayers, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will build him a house in Jannah, right? And the prayers that he specifically mentioned were 4 cycles before Dhuhr and 2 cycles after it, 2 cycles before Maghrib, and 2 cycles after Isha, and 2 cycles before the Fajr prayer. And so we'll be looking at each of these individual sunan prayers and whether they are confirmed sunnahs or whether they are merely recommended. And so let's take a quick recap first of the sunnah. Right? We took what the sunnah was at the very beginning of our course in Kitab al-Tahara. And so we'll take a quick recap of what we discussed over there. And so we know that the term sunnah is basically defined in various ways by the ulama. And its basic definition is a path that is traversed. And so when it comes to texts of fiqh, the major distinction when it comes to the sunnah is between the sunnah mu'akkada and the sunnah ghayr mu'akkada. Right? The confirmed sunnah, or the emphasized sunnah, and then the non-confirmed sunnah, which is associated often with something that is mustahab or recommended. And the confirmed sunnah, the way the ulama usually define it, is that the confirmed sunnah is a sunnah that is performed diligently and perpetually without leave by the Prophet ﷺ. So any action relating to ibadah that the Prophet ﷺ performed diligently and perpetually without leave, then that is an indication that that action is a confirmed sunnah. And then we have the non-confirmed sunnah. This was an action that the Prophet ﷺ performed sometimes and he left sometimes. He performed occasionally and he left it occasionally. And the fact that he left it occasionally is an indication that it is a non-confirmed sunnah. Now, this is the basic definition that ulama usually give when it comes to what the confirmed sunnah is in terms of the law. But the sunnah also serves a specific purpose. And this is why many ulama, like Ibn Abdin in his Hashiyah, he mentions that the reason why the Prophet ﷺ was persistent and perpetual on some actions was because those actions related to perfecting and completing an obligatory act of worship or something that was recognized as one of the symbols of the religion. And this is why the Sunnah Mu'akkada is also termed as the Sunnah al-Huda, right? The Sunnah related to guidance, as opposed to merely a Sunnah of Ada or a Sunnah related to habit. And guidance most fully relates to those aspects of our religion that are obligations or those aspects of our religion that are recognized as being symbols and pillars of the faith. And so when you look at something like wudu, if you look at all the sunan of wudu, right? If you look at all the sunan of wudu, the confirmed sunan that the ulama identified, then all of those actions that they identify as confirmed sunan relate back to this idea of perfecting one's wudu. And so something like washing the limbs 3 times is a confirmed sunnah. Why is it a confirmed sunnah? Because it perfects your act of washing and it ensures that your limbs are actually being washed completely. When it comes to interlacing your fingers in wudu, the reason why this is a confirmed sunnah is because, again, it ensures that your limbs are being properly washed, right? And so what we have is this idea of these sunnah actions doing takmeel of the fard actions or of actions that are deemed symbols of the religion. And so because of this, because of their association with this idea of completing or perfecting the fard, and because the Prophet was perpetual on these actions, the ruling that the ulama give for a confirmed sunnah is that leaving it without excuse is blameworthy. And to do so as a habit can be potentially sinful, right? It won't reach the level of sin of leaving out something that is obligatory or wajib, but there will be some sinfulness associated with it if you make it a habit without excuse to leave a confirmed sunnah. Whereas leaving a non-confirmed sunnah, something that is mandub or mustahab, this is neither blameworthy nor is it sinful, even if done regularly. Although it is optimal, of course, to perform the mustahab actions, because just as the sunnah completes the fard and the wajib, the mandub and the mustahab oftentimes complete the sunnah actions. And this is how, and we've taken principles related to this before when discussing the tashahhud, when discussing other actions of worship, and why some ulama deem them sunnah, some ulama deem them wajib, and so on and so forth. So you can return back to those lessons and better understand and recall those principles. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is because you can see that there are similar concepts that are popping up throughout the furu' over here, throughout the legal rulings of the Hanafis. You had a conception in the Sunnah in wudu that's being paralleled in the prayer when it comes to rulings like the Tashahhud and the Fatiha and so forth. And then you have it being displayed over here as well when it comes to the Nawafil Prayers, as we will take. And so the Sunnah prayers that are associated with the obligatory prayers, such as the 2 sunan before Fajr prayer, the 2 cycles before Fajr prayer, these also fulfill the same meaning. They were actions that the Prophet ﷺ did diligently, without fail, and he encouraged his companions to do them as well, and his followers. And the reason why they were legislated is because they act to complete and perfect one's obligatory prayer. In what way? But by ensuring that the prayer is preceded by or followed by another prayer that makes up for any deficiencies that one may have fallen into in the prayer itself, in the obligatory prayer itself. And so all the actions of the Prophet ﷺ that surround the obligatory prayers, when it comes to the tasbihat, when it comes to the sunan prayers, etc., etc., all of these serve the function of making up for any deficiency that an individual may have had in his obligatory prayers, right? Because we lack khushu', we lack mindfulness, we may not be completely into our prayer and focused, and so on and so forth. Our recitation may not be, it may be valid but not the best. And so these sunnah prayers and the adhkar that follow the salah are meant to make up for those deficiencies in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the sunnah prayers in this context also fulfill that same meaning of something the Prophet performed diligently and something that completed and perfected the obligatory actions to which they were associated. Now let's begin looking at each of these sunnah prayers. So Imam al-Quduri begins with the 2 cycles of the Fajr prayer. And these 2 cycles are the most emphatic of all the sunnah prayers. And they are so emphatic that the Hanafi fuqaha actually treated them akin to a wajib when it came to specific legal rulings. And we've taken this again in previous lessons briefly. So Fajr, for example, cannot be prayed. The normal ruling when it comes to any supererogatory prayer, whether it's a confirmed sunnah or a non-confirmed sunnah, is that you can pray it on a riding mount, or you can pray it in a car, and you can pray it without standing, simply with bowing and prostration. But the Fajr prayer was made an exception to that rule by the Hanafis. And so the Hanafi said that no, the Fajr prayer is going to be treated almost like a wajib when it comes to the allowance of praying it in a car with head movements, or the allowance of praying it simply with bowing and prostration without actually standing. And the reason for this is because after the witr prayer, there is no prayer that is more emphasized by the Prophet ﷺ. And so here on the right, there are 2 traditions from the Prophet ﷺ. The first is, he is speaking about the Fajr prayer. He says it is khayrun min ad-dunya wa ma fiha. It is better than the world and all that is in it. And then he tells his companions, as related in Abu Dawood, that do not omit these sunnah of Fajr, even if the horses drive you away. Even if the horses drive you away. And so this is a very emphatic instruction from the Prophet ﷺ that the Fajr prayer should be performed, and one should make it a point not to leave its performance. And so this is why, because of these hadith and several others, the Hanafi fuqaha deemed the 2 cycles before the Fajr to be the most emphatic of all the sunan related to the obligatory prayers. Then we have Dhuhr. Dhuhr is also a highly emphasized and confirmed sunnah. The 4 cycles before Dhuhr, and then the 2 cycles after Dhuhr as well. Now the 4 cycles before Dhuhr they count as a sunnah if you perform them with a single taslima, meaning you pray the entire 4 cycles and you only say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah at the end. And again, this is because this was the practice of the Prophet ﷺ. This was the normative and regular practice of the Prophet ﷺ. And the reason why this has been identified as a confirmed sunnah is because of this hadith that we took earlier from Abu Dawood, where the Prophet ﷺ points out 12 prayers that he tells believers to be persistent upon in order to attain such and such reward. And 4 cycles before Dhuhr and 2 cycles after it are explicitly mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ in those traditions. And there are various other ahadith from the Prophet ﷺ regarding the merits of these prayers. Then we have Salatul Asr. Salatul Asr is the only prayer that does not have any confirmed sunnah associated with it. And all the sunnah prayers associated with Salatul Asr are considered mandub or recommended. And the reason for this is because the hadith that forms the foundation of this particular chapter, right, which is that hadith that we took from Abu Dawood regarding the 12 cycles of prayer, it does not mention anything regarding performing a supererogatory prayer before Asr or after Asr, right? If you go back to the hadith again, right here, there is no mention in this particular hadith of Salatul Asr, right? And so the Hanafi ulama said that this indicates that the Prophet ﷺ did not perform this act diligently, nor did he instruct his companions and followers to be diligent in the performance of these sunnah. Even though there are specific hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that he would perform specific sunnah prayers before Asr, but they do not reach the level of strength to be deemed a confirmed sunnah. And this is why Imam Muhammad in Kitab al-Asl simply refers to them, to the performance of these sunnah prayers associated with Asr, as being hasan. They are simply good, but they are not something that are confirmed sunnahs. And then we have the Maghrib prayer. And again, the hadith in Abu Dawood mentions وَرَكْعَتَيْن بَعْدَ الْمَغْرِبِ, 2 cycles after Maghrib are also confirmed sunnahs. There are various hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that he would perform 6, and so performing 6 cycles is also considered a recommendation, right? So 2 cycles are a confirmed sunnah, and then extending it to 6 is considered mandub or mustahab in the Hanafi school. And then finally we have the Isha prayer, وَرَكْعَتَيْن بَعْدَ الْإِشَاءِ, in the hadith of Abu Dawood, and these are also confirmed sunnah. As for the 4 before it, they are recommended, and the same is the case with the 4 that precede the Isha prayer. Both of them are considered confirmed sunnah prayers. They are considered recommended sunnah prayers. The 2 cycles after Isha are considered confirmed sunnah prayers. Again, it all relates back to this particular hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ stipulated which 12 cycles people should diligently perform. And so that was pretty straightforward, right? That's something that beyond identifying which specific prayers are confirmed sunan and which are mustahab, generally we all know the prayers associated with the obligatory prayers. We know the sunan associated with the obligatory prayers. So Imam al-Quduri continues by saying that وَنَوَافِلُ النَّهَارِ إِنْ شَاءَ صَلَّ رَكْعَتَيْن بِتَسْلِيمَةٍ وَاحِدَةٍ وَإِنْ شَاءَ أَرْبَعًا وَتُكْرَهُ الزِّيَادَةُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ. Regarding the supererogatory prayers of the daytime, then one may read them as 2 cycles with a single taslima, or as 4, and it is disliked to do more than this with a single taslima. And this, simply the argument that the Hanafis make for this is that this is not an action that has been transmitted from the Prophet ﷺ, that during the daytime he would perform a prayer that was more than 4 cycles. Right? This is not transmitted from the Prophet ﷺ. And so this would be deemed somewhat disliked to do. Rather, one should either stick to 2 cycles or maximum 4 cycles with a single taslima, because this is the practice of the Prophet ﷺ. Then Imam al-Quduri continues, وَأَمَّا نَافِلَةُ اللَّيْلِ فَقَالَ أبو حنيفة إن صلى 8 ركعات بتسليمة واحدة جاز وتكره الزيادة على ذلك، وقال لا يزيد بالليل على ركعتين بتسليمة واحدة. As for the supererogatory prayers at night, Abu Hanifa said that if one performs 8 cycles with a single taslima, it is permitted, and more than this is disliked. And his 2 companions said, one does not perform more than 2 cycles with a single taslima at night time. So over here, Abu Hanifa, the reason why, so you can perform an 8 cycled Nawafil prayer with 1 single salam at the end. And so you have a sitting, you sit down between after every 2 cycles, but you don't say the salam, you stand up until the 8th cycle, right? And so it's a very long prayer. And so with Abu Hanifa, this is considered, it is permitted to perform prayer at night in this manner, right? So you can do it as 2s, you can do it as 4s, you can do it as 6s, you can do it as 8 cycles with a single taslima. Whereas the Sahibain, what they said was, their preference was, no, you should perform it as 2 cycles with a single taslima at night. And in the position of the Sahibain over here, they're speaking about what is more optimal in their eyes. Of course, the Sahibain, they consider it permitted to perform 4 cycles, but Imam al-Quduri over here is mentioning what they deem to be more preferable at night time, which is to perform 2 cycled prayers. Now, the position of Abu Hanifa, whereas in the daytime there was nothing established from the Prophet ﷺ regarding him performing a prayer that was more than 4 cycles with a single taslima, there are specific traditions from the Prophet ﷺ that describe him praying at least up until 8 cycles with a single taslima. And so in Sahih Muslim, we have this hadith that I think Sayyidah Aisha relates, that the Prophet ﷺ would perform these raka'at, these 8 cycles, without sitting between them for a final sitting. Right? That's what the hadith means. That the Prophet ﷺ would perform 8 cycles without sitting in between them with a final sitting, and so he would not perform simply 2 cycles, then say the salam and stand up, and then 2 cycles, say the salam and then stand up and start a new prayer, and so on and so forth. He would perform 8 cycles, and then only at the end would he do a taslima to exit the prayer. Abu Hanifa, however, had a general rule. The rule that Abu Hanifa had was that during the daytime and during the nighttime, it is optimal to perform 4 cycled prayers. It is optimal to perform 4 cycled prayers. And the reason for this was because Abu Hanifa said, when you look at the various sunan that the Prophet ﷺ performed, many of them in relation to Dhahar and Asr and Isha are 4 cycled prayers. Abu Hanifa also said a 4 cycled prayer at night time is the tahrima is more lengthier, and the prayer is longer, and so it is more difficult. And there's this idea of night prayers having an element of difficulty associated with them, and so 4 cycles being the prophetic norm, plus being lengthier and more harder than 2 cycles, that is why Abu Hanifa gives it preference over simply praying 2 cycles, which was the preference of the Sahibain. So the Sahibain, what they said was, at night time, you pray 2 cycles with 1 taslima. And one of the arguments of the Sahibain was that, well, when you look at Salat al-Tarawih, the Prophet ﷺ, his practice was to pray 2 cycles, 2 cycles, 2 cycles, 2 cycles as independent prayers, right? And so this indicates to us that this is more superior. Abu Hanifa's response to that is that the Tarawih prayer, is connected to a congregational setting, in many instances. And so 2 cycles gives people a degree of istiraha. It gives them a moment to exit the prayer and just like relax for a few moments before proceeding to the next one. And this is more in keeping with the idea that the congregation is meant to facilitate the affairs of the congregation, and that it is not supposed to be something that discourages them from attending a congregation. And so if you have a 4 cycle prayer in which you're reciting 50 pages of the Quran, then this is something that is very difficult on people. And so 2 cycles makes more sense in light of that. And of course we know that this is a general principle regarding the congregational prayer, which is that it should be performed in a way that does not discourage people from attending it. Then we have recitation, and this is again something we've taken, so we'll just read it without much explanation. وَالْقِرَاءَةُ فِي الْفَرْضِ وَاجِبَةٌ فِي رَكْعَتَيْنِ الْأُولَيَيْنِ. Recitation in the obligatory prayer is obligatory in the first 2 cycles. And again, we took the reason for this, فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ, where this establishes recitation in 1 cycle, and then by way of Dalalatul Nas, the Hanafi ulama argued that it should also be obligatory in a 2nd cycle because of the resemblance between the 2. وهو مخير في الأخريين إن شاء قرأ الفاتحة وإن شاء صبح وإن شاء سكت. And then in the obligatory prayer, one has a choice in the last 2. And of course this refers to a 4-cycled obligatory prayer. So Dhuhr and Asr and Isha. One has a choice in the last 2 cycles. He may recite the Fatiha, or he may simply do tasbih, Subhanallah, 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 or he may stay silent to the extent of the tasbih. And again, we discussed this when we looked at the fiqh of recitation in the arkan of Salah. And this was the practice of many of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And so we have a obligatory recitation, and then we have a non-obligatory recitation and context in which we have a choice in regard to whether we recite or do not recite, and if we recite something, what is it exactly that we recite. So in the final 2 cycles of a obligatory prayer, we have a choice if we want to recite between the Fatiha and between saying tasbihat, or we have a choice between recitation and not reciting anything at all. But you still have to stand, they say, in those final 2 cycles for the extent where it will be possible for you to say Subhanallah 3 times. This is what the fuqaha mentioned. And then he says, وَالْقِرَاءَةُ وَاجِبَةٌ فِي جَمِيعِ رَكَعَاتِ النَّفْلِ وَفِي جَمِيعِ الْوِتْرِ. Recitation is obligatory in all the cycles of a supererogatory prayer and witr as well. Why is it obligatory in all cycles of a nafil prayer? Well, the reason that we mentioned earlier, we've mentioned this before, is that when you pray, if you're praying a 2-cycled nafil prayer, then it's pretty clear why recitation is obligatory in both these cycles, right? Because it goes back to that point of Dalalatul Nas, فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ, and the idea of applying Dalalatul Nas to it. As for a 4-cycled prayer, why doesn't a 4-cycled nafil prayer resemble a 4-cycled fard prayer when it comes to recitation? It is because when you pray a 4-cycled nafil prayer, this is treated as you praying 2 different prayers. The first 2 rak'ahs are 1 prayer, the second 2 rak'ahs are a independent 2nd prayer, right? And so because these are deemed 2 independent prayers, each of them require recitation in the first 2 cycles of their prayers. Whereas the obligatory prayer, the whole prayer is 4 cycles, right? The entire prayer is 4 cycles. And so what is obligatory upon you in a obligatory prayer is simply to recite in the first 2 cycles of the prayer itself. And we've taken the khilaf on whether it is in the first 2 cycles itself, or any 2 cycles, and then if you miss it in one of the cycles, can you do qada of it? The ulama say yes, you can do qada of it at a later cycle. And that these are details that we've taken in previous lessons. And then he says, وَمَنْ دَخَلَ فِي صَلَاةِ النَّفْلِ ثُمَّ أَفْسَدَهَا قَضَاهَا. Whoever commences a supererogatory prayer and then invalidates it, makes it up. And this is something that is contrary to the view of Imam al-Shafi'i, who says that you do not have to make it up. The Hanafis, basically, what the Hanafis did was, they said that this returns to an ayah of the Quran, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا أَعْمَالَكُمْ. Do not nullify your deeds. And so we have 2 topic governing principles that are extracted from this particular verse, and both these topic governing principles are related to each other. They're different ways of expressing the same idea. The first topic governing principle is that commencing an act of worship makes it necessary to preserve it from being nullified or invalidated. Okay, when you commence an act of worship, now you are obligated to preserve that act from anything that will nullify or invalidate it. And again, this relates to this Quranic verse, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا أَعْمَالَكُمْ. And then a second topic governing principle, the way other ulama express this particular issue, is commencing an act of worship makes it binding upon one. Right? Commencing an act of worship makes it binding upon one. Ashuru'u mulzimun. That commencing an act of worship now makes that act something that one is obligated to perform and complete. And so how does this relate to a nafil? So over here we have a little breakdown of the steps in the thinking process over here. So when you begin a nafil, you are engaged in an act of worship. Right? When you begin a nafil, you are engaged in an act of worship. You have decided to engage in an act of worship. Nullifying this act is not considered permissible. Why? Because of the Quranic verse that we took. Thus, this act of worship has to be preserved from being invalidated. And so when one starts the deed, it becomes necessary to complete it. And this is where we have these 2 topic governing principles. Right? This is an expression or an application of these 2 topic governing principles. If one does invalidate it, he has invalidated an act of worship that he was required to complete and preserve. And therefore, he must make it up as a remedial measure. But the idea of a make-up is you're remedying some deficiency, some inability to fulfill your obligation, some inability to fulfill what was required upon you. That is when this idea of a make-up comes into the picture. And because you were obligated and required to preserve your prayer and safeguard it from being invalidated or nullified, which entailed being obligated to complete it, because this was an obligation upon you, by beginning and entering into a nafil prayer, by not fulfilling this obligation, you are required to make it up as a remedial measure. Right? And so this is the basic line of reasoning that the Hanafi ulama apply to this issue, and it returns to this Quranic verse, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا أَعْمَالَكُمْ, and then these 2 topic governing principles that express the idea contained in this verse. So hopefully that is clear. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions فَإِنْ صَلَّى 4 ركعات وقعد في الأوليين مقدار التشهد ثم أفسد الأخريين قدر ركعتين. Right? If he prayed 4 cycles and sits after the first 2 for the extent of the tashahhud, and then invalidates the last 2 cycles, he makes up 2 cycles. And again, this returns to that point that we just mentioned a few moments ago, which is the idea that, and of course over here he's talking about a nafil prayer. He's not talking about a fard prayer. He's talking about a nafil prayer. And what did we mention? We mentioned that unlike the obligatory prayer, when you pray 4 cycles of a nafil prayer, they are not considered one single prayer. You're effectively, what you're doing is you're combining 2 prayers. You're combining a 2-cycled prayer with another 2-cycled prayer. You're combining a 2-cycled nafil prayer with another 2-cycled Nafil prayer. And so what happens over here? Let's say you perform 4 cycles of the Nafil prayer. Right? After 2 cycles, you sit up, you recite the tashahhud, then you stand up again for the 3rd cycle. In the 3rd cycle, you laugh out loud, or you pass wind, or you have a nosebleed, or whatever it may be, and your prayer is invalidated. You decide your prayer is invalidated. Your first 2 rak'ahs will still count. You are still deemed to have prayed 2 cycles of a nafil prayer. Why? Because 2 cycles, the prayer is 2 cycles itself, and you've completed all the arkan of that prayer. The final rukn of that prayer was sitting for the extent of the tashahhud. And over here you've performed that. And so effectively your first prayer, your first 2 cycles, which count as an independent prayer, you have completed that prayer by sitting for the extent of the tashahhud, right? And so this is why when you do something that invalidates your prayer in the 3rd cycle or the 4th cycle, effectively you're treated as nullifying or invalidating this second nafil prayer that you have now begun with the 3rd cycle. And your first 2 cycles, which count as the first nafil prayer that you're engaged in, are considered valid because you finished all the arkan related to that specific prayer. And so this is one of the differences between the nafil prayer and the fard prayer. In the fard prayer, if this were to happen, your whole prayer is invalidated. Why? Because all 4 cycles of the dhuhr prayer or the asr prayer are treated as their one single prayer, unlike the nafil prayer. And so again, we see various rulings that we've taken before appearing in this context, right? The nature of the nafil prayer, the nature of a 4-cycle nafil prayer, the place of the tashahhud and sitting for the extent of the tashahhud, and so on and so forth. These are all rulings that we've taken before. And so at this point, when you read this particular ruling, you should at least be able to understand, there's a reason why Imam al-Quduri over here is mentioning that he sat miqdar al-tashahhud, that he sat for the extent of the tashahhud. Right? Why is Imam al-Quduri mentioning this? He's mentioning this for a reason, because this is the last of the arkan of the prayer. Okay? And so you should also begin thinking from the way Imam Quduri has phrased this particular ruling. What if he had not sat for the miqdar al-tashahhud? What if he had gotten up straight into the 3rd cycle without sitting for this extent? What would the ruling be then? And these are things that students should think through in terms of scenarios. And then Imam al-Quduri mentions وَيُصَلِّي النَّافِلَ قَائِدًا مَعَ الْقُدْرَةِ عَلَى الْقِيَامِ. One can pray supererogatory prayer sitting, even if able to stand. وَإِنْ افتتحها قائما ثم قعد من غير عذر جاز عند أبي حنيفة وقال لا يجوز إلا من عذر. If he commences the prayer standing and then sits without an excuse, it is permitted with Abu Hanifa, while the 2 companions said it is not permitted except with an excuse. Now over here, we have a topic governing principle again, and this topic governing principle is that any prayer in which the obligation of prostration is lifted, the obligation of standing is also lifted. Any prayer in which the obligation of prostration is lifted, the obligation of standing is also lifted. And we discussed this very briefly in a previous lesson, which was the idea that even though standing is considered one of the arkan of prayer, one of the integrals and the obligatory actions of prayer, the Hanafi fuqaha in their minds almost had a conception of different arkan being on different levels of importance. Because the prayer is ultimately about humility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And humility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and reverence to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and humbling yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most completely and perfectly found in the act of sajda. Right? It is most completely found in the act of prostration. Standing has an element of reverence to it, but it does not manifest reverence in the same way that prostration does. And so this is why the fuqaha understood why standing could be deemed non-obligatory in specific prayers, but prostration was another issue altogether, because prostration is really the essence of the prayer, right? And more so than that, the simple act of bending the head in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which we do when someone is in a state that he is unable to prostrate. The Hanafis did not have a notion of simply praying with your eyelids. Some of the ulama mentioned that if you're unable to do with head movements, you're completely paralyzed, do you pray with just your eye movements, or do you pray with your heart? And the Hanafi said, no, you do not, because the prayer is an act of humbling yourself to your Lord, and the minimal form of that is bowing your head slightly out of submission to him. And when you're not able to do that, then there is no prayer. And so prostration is the most complete expression of that reverence and of that humbling of oneself before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas standing has an element of reverence, but it is also understood as a means by which one prostrates, right? That you stand and then you go into prostration. So it is a means by which you actualize the act of prostration. And so the Hanafis had this copy governing principle that any prayer in which the obligation of prostration is lifted, the obligation of standing is also lifted, because prostration is stronger in what it represents for the prayer than the act of standing. And so when prostration is lifted, then the obligation of standing, a fortiori, is also lifted. And then it is established from the Prophet that he did pray the supererogatory prayers, the Nawafil prayers, sitting and without an excuse. And there are numerous reports in this regard in the various texts of hadith from Ibn Umar and Anas and several others, that they would see the Prophet ﷺ perform the prayer, the Nawafil prayer, sitting without an excuse. And the reason why the Prophet ﷺ did this, and the reason why he came and taught his companions that this was permitted, was because the basis when it comes to the Nawafil prayer is that their performance should be facilitated for people. Why is that? Because the Nawafil prayer are endless. They are not restricted by number. They are not restricted by a time, generally speaking, right? They are not like the obligatory prayers. The obligatory prayers, you pray 4 cycles of Dhuhr and that's it, you're finished. You pray 4 cycles within a specific prayer and that's it, you're done now. But the basis of supererogatory prayers is you can pray as many as you want. And so in order to facilitate the believer in engaging in these supererogatory acts as much as he is able to, in order to facilitate this matter for him, the Sharia, what it did was it loosened some of the conditions and the arkan linked to the supererogatory prayers so that individuals could more easily perform them, right? And so, if you obligate all the things that you've obligated for the obligatory prayer, if you do the same for the supererogatory prayer, then it might discourage people from performing them. It might be an impediment to their continual and increased performance. Whereas when you loosen those restrictions, when you loosen those conditions, then you facilitate people in performing the supererogatory prayers as much as possible. And this is why you have various rulings related to Nawafil that are relaxed in general. You have the standing, you have the fact that you can combine various Nawafil together. You do not have to do the taslim at the end and then start with the tahrima for another prayer, right? As we've mentioned, you can just go, you can pray it as 4 cycled or 6 cycled or 8 cycle during the nighttime especially. And that's interesting because the nighttime is the period in which these Nawafil prayers are particularly emphasized. And so you see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet have permitted performing them, to this really extensive amount of 8 cycles without having to exit it with a taslima, and initiate a new prayer with a new tahrima. So hopefully that is clear. Now, this issue that Imam al-Quduri mentions, if one began or commenced the prayer standing and then sat down without an excuse, it is permitted with Abu Hanifa, and his Sahibain said, no, it is not permitted. What's the issue with this over here? The issue with this, why is this khilaf over here? Well, Abu Hanifa's reasoning was very simple. Abu Hanifa's reasoning was, well, the default is that you can pray Nawafil prayers sitting down, right? You can commence this prayer sitting down whether you have an excuse or not. This is something that the sacred law has permitted. You do not have to stand. Standing is not considered a rukn or an integral of the nafil prayer. And so he has this principle that every state in which it is permitted to begin a prayer in, it is permitted to perform the prayer in that state for as long as that prayer continues. So if it's okay to begin nafil prayer sitting down, then it's okay for you to sit down in the middle of the nafil prayer and continue praying in that state, even if you began it standing, right? You have a choice. You had a choice at the beginning, you have a choice in the middle, you have a choice towards the end. It's up to you. Abu Yusuf and Muhammad had a more sort of complicated idea behind why this would not be permitted. Why it would not be permitted for an individual to begin a nafil prayer standing and then decide to sit, in the middle of it and continue prayer in that way. And so we'll just read what the principle they mention states. They say that commencing a prayer is the cause obligating it, just like a vow. Commencing a prayer is the cause that obligates it, just like a vow. And if you recall from the disliked prayer times that we took previously, we mentioned this exact same point. What did we say when we talk about what is the sabab for the wujub of salah on a person? What is the cause that obligates prayer on an individual? Usually we say it is the entry of the time. When the time for prayer enters, the wujub is now established on an individual. But then the ulama discuss, okay, what type of wujub is this? Is this an immediate wujub? Is this a very constricted wujub? Is this an expansive wujub? And what they mean by that is, well, when dhuhr time enters, yes, the wujub of praying dhuhr, the obligation of praying dhuhr is established, but it is an expansive obligation in the sense that you still have 2 hours to pray. So you're not required to pray at the beginning of the time, right? So they ask this question, when does it become specifically obligated upon you? Like when is that moment when we can say now the prayer is specifically and immediately obligatory upon you and you must enter into it? And so the fuqaha usually mention two things, as we stated in the earlier lesson. One is when the time for prayer becomes so constricted that the time remaining is only that amount that is sufficient or enough for you to perform the obligatory prayer in. It takes you 5 minutes to pray, or let's say 2 minutes to pray the dhuhr prayer, and there's only 2 minutes left before dhuhr prayer exits, before the time for dhuhr prayer exits. At that moment, when there's 2 minutes left, it becomes specifically and immediately obligatory upon you to perform the prayer. There's also a second situation in which it becomes immediately obligatory upon you. That is when you actually commence the prayer. As soon as you decide to say Allahu Akbar, you have obligated the prayer on yourself at that moment, right? Whether it's at the beginning of the time or the end of the time. And this relates to the idea that we took earlier again, the topic governing principle, ash-shuru'u mulzimun, that when you begin something, then that becomes something that is obligatory and required upon you, right? And so Abu Yusuf and Muhammad said that commencing a prayer is the cause obligating it, just like a vow. Okay, just like a vow. When you say, I vow to do X, Y, and Z, then the vow obligates something upon you. And similarly, commencing a prayer obligates something upon you, which is the prayer itself. And so if one vowed to perform prayer, it is obligatory upon him to do so with qiyam. Likewise, when he commences it. And so Abu Yusuf and Muhammad made a qiyas between the vow and the commencement of prayer. When a vow is the cause for you to perform something obligatory, right? And if you vow to perform prayer, then it is obligatory upon you to fulfill that prayer with the qiyam. Why? Because this is the most perfect state of the prayer. When you think about prayer, when you say the word prayer, your mind automatically goes to what form? It automatically goes to this idea of standing and then prostrating and ruku and qira'ah and so on and so forth. And so that is how you must fulfill that vow. Similarly, when you commence a prayer in the standing position, you have obligated upon yourself a prayer in that particular form. Right? You have obligated upon yourself prayer in that particular form. And so you cannot now simply decide to sit in the middle of prayer, which is a more deficient form of the prayer than one which has all the actions. You cannot simply decide to do that once you've initiated the prayer in a standing position and thus obligated upon yourself prayer in that specific form. And so this is the reason of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. And again, we have taken topic governing principles. There are at least 3 or 4 principles we've taken in past lessons that are appearing in this particular issue and the justification that Abu Yusuf and Muhammad have forwarded for their position. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions ومن كان خارج المصر يتنفل على دابته إلى أي جهة توجهت يومي إيماء. Whoever is outside the city may perform the supererogatory prayer on his riding mount towards any direction that he faces with head movements. And again, this relates to, and there are various hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ on this. And this is based on the reasons that we mentioned earlier regarding, the idea of facilitating the Nawafil prayer. And so over here in Bukhari, there's a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ, one of his companions saw him pray with head movements on his riding mount. This is a matter of istihsan. We've taken istihsan before several times now, so we won't get into the detail of that. But the basis is that prayer needs to be performed with at least bowing and prostration, not while you're riding on a mount without facing the Qibla, without doing X, Y, and Z. But because this is specifically established from the Prophet ﷺ, that he would perform on a riding mount when outside of quote-unquote city or town limits, this has been deemed permissible by the ulama. And they rationalize it by saying that, once again, the entire idea of the Nawafil is that it is based on facilitation, which requires a relaxing of some of the rules associated with it. And usually it is very difficult for people in a state of quote-unquote travel, or people who are outside of the city limits, who are in their riding vehicles, to stop and perform Nawafil prayers. And so in order to facilitate the performance of these Nawafil, these supererogatory prayers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed individuals to pray on their riding mounts or in their cars, and so on and so forth. And this is a matter of istihsan, as we've said. And so with that, we've concluded the section on the Nawafil prayer. And now we'll begin the section on the Forgetfulness Prostration. And this section, again, is not too difficult. It's fairly straightforward because it relates back to a lot of what we've already taken. And so Imam al-Quduri mentions Bab Sujood Sahw. And what does he say? It is wajibun fi ziyadati wa nuqsani ba'd salam. It is the prostration of forgetfulness is wajib after the salam for any increase or decrease. And how does one perform it? One performs 2 prostrations, sajdatain, thumma yatashahhadu wa yusallim. One performs 2 prostrations, then tashahhud, and then the taslim. Right? So over here, forgetfulness prostration, there are 3 main discussions that we can take. One is the ruling of this prostration. The second is the method, and the third is the reasons that obligate this prostration or necessitate this prostration. And so when it comes to the ruling, some of the ulama said that it is wajib. There are other ulama in the Hanafi school that say that it is a sunnah. The opinion that it is a wajib is the sounder view in the school. And the reason for this is because, once again, the whole idea of the forgetfulness prostration is that it is to remedy any deficiency in the prayer. And so in a way, it is analogous to the expiation that we give during the Hajj. So during the Hajj, there are specific actions that we are not permitted to engage in when in a state of ihram. And when you perform those actions, it becomes wajib upon you to, perform a sacrifice or give sadaqah and so on and so forth, depending on the type of breach that you have committed. And so similarly, any deficiency in the prayer will make it required for a remedial act to be taken in order to offset that particular deficiency. As for the method, then Imam al-Quduri mentions, what does he state? That it is, you perform 2 prostrations after the salam. Now, there are various hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, regarding prostration of forgetfulness being performed after giving salam. So in Abu Dawood from Thawban, that the Prophet ﷺ said, لِكُلِّ سَهْوٍ سَجْدَتَانِ بَعْدَ مَا يُسَلِّمُ. That for every forgetfulness, there are 2 prostrations after one has given the salam. And in Abu Dawood and Nasa'i from Abdullah ibn Ja'far, that the Prophet ﷺ said that man shakka fi salatihi, whoever has doubts in regard to his prayer, what should he do? He should yasjud sajdatain ba'da ma yusallim, that he should perform 2 prostrations after giving the salam. Right? And these 2 prostrations are the prostrations of forgetfulness. Now, these reports do not mention whether this forgetfulness prostration, are you performing it after the first salam or after the second salam? So in the Hanafi school, we find both views mentioned, that you do the sajda, the forgetfulness prostration, after saying Assalamu alaikum once, or you do it after saying Assalamu alaikum twice. The position that you do it after the first is considered, it seems to be the majority view, whereas the position that states that you do it after giving both salams is also a strong position in the school, and was held by people like Imam al-Marghinani and others. And so both these are, valid views in the school, and the difference returns to the fact that it hasn't been clearly stipulated in the ahadith regarding whether the prostrations of forgetfulness are performed after 2 salams or after a single salam. Then we have Imam al-Quduri mentioning, وَسُجُودُ السَّهْوِ يَلْزِمُ الْمُصَلِّي إذا زاد في صلاته فعلا من جنسها ليس منها، أو ترك فعلا مسنونا، أو ترك قراءة فاتحة الكتاب، أو القنوت، أو التشهد، أو تكبيرات العيدين، أو جهر الإمام بالقراءة فيما يخافت، أو خافت فيما يجهر. That the prostration of forgetfulness is wajib upon the praying person. One, for the following reasons: when he adds an action to the prayer that is from the prayer but not part of it, when he leaves an act prescribed by the Sunnah, when he leaves the Fatiha, Qunut, Tashahhud, or the Takbirat al-Eid, or when the Imam recites out loud in a prayer performed silently, or silently in a prayer that is performed out loud. Right? So these are examples that Imam al-Quduri has given. So now we've taken the ruling, the method. What are the reasons for this forgetfulness prostration? The simple way of teaching this, there's a complicated way and there's a simple way. So we'll go with the simple way. The simple way of teaching this is that the forgetfulness prostration is wajib by the leaving of a wajib. So whenever you leave a wajib in the prayer, then you are required to make a forgetfulness prostration. This is the simplest way to explain this particular issue. And so this can be treated as the topic governing principle. And so let's look at all these examples that Imam al-Quduri brings. First is adding an action to the prayer. And specifically, how does Imam al-Quduri frame this? He says, زاد في صلاته فعلا من جنسها ليس منها. Right? What are the actions from the jinns of the salah, from the genus of the prayer? These are bowing, prostrating, standing. These are actions that are from the prayer. And what does it mean, but not part of it? He means something like a second ruku', performing a second ruku' after the first one, in a single cycle, performing a third sajda after you've performed two. Right? These are examples of adding an action to the prayer that are originally from the prayer, but not part of it. And the reason for this, why does this require a forgetfulness prostration? Because it entails leaving a wajib. And what is the wajib over here? It is wajib upon the one praying to move on to the next act or the next rukan without any delay. And so, when you perform a third sajda, you have delayed in either getting up for the first or last sitting, or you have delayed getting up for the standing position. So you're in your first cycle, you go down for sajda, you do one sajda, you do two sajdas. Now you're meant to stand up. You're meant to go back into the standing position, which is a rukn of the prayer. And so it is wajib upon you in the prayer to do that without an undue delay. You should do that without any act interfering between your sajda and your act of standing. But when you do a third sajda, what you've done is you've added something to the prayer, added an additional action to the prayer that delays the wujub of standing back up for the second cycle. And this entails leaving a wajib. Similarly, if you are in your second cycle, you do one sajda, you do two sajdas, now you're meant to sit up and perform the tashahhud. And that sitting is considered wajib. But by performing a third sajda, which is not part of the prayer, which was not legislated as being part of the prayer, you have delayed going into that sitting position, and thus you have left that wajib of going from one act to another without this delay. Then we have this very complicated issue, and the somewhat confusing issue of Imam al-Quduri mentioning أو ترك فعلا مسنونا, when he leaves an act prescribed by the Sunnah. And to be fair, I don't really have a very convincing explanation for this. One of the confusing aspects of the forgetfulness prostration is the way later ulama frame it, and then the way earlier ulama frame it is completely different. The way they identify the main principles underlying when forgetfulness prostration is wajib, it's very different when you look at Imam al-Quduri, Imam al-Natifi, and others, and when you look at later ulama like Imam al-Baghinani, Sahib al-Wiqaya, and then Ibn Nujaym, Ibn Abdin, and others, they express it in a very different way. So over here, what al-Baghinani does is when he addresses this point of Imam al-Quduri, that leaving an act prescribed by the Sunnah, this requires the forgetfulness prostration. Imam al-Marghinani, in a way, he scratches his head a little bit, and he says, well, it seems like what Imam al-Quduri is saying over here is an act that is wajib and established by the Sunnah. A wajib act established by the Sunnah. Right? So when Imam al-Quduri mentions ترك فعلا مسنونا, what he means is that he ترك فعلا واجبا, right? ثبت وجوبه بالسنة. That you leave an act that is wajib, whose wujub is established by way of the Sunnah. This is how Imam al-Marghinani and others explain this statement of Imam al-Quduri. We would have to do some research into whether that is what Imam al-Quduri actually meant, because Imam al-Quduri mentions some of these actions later on, leaving the Fatiha, Qunut, Tashahhud, and Takbirat of Eid. These are all quote-unquote wajib actions that are established by way of the Sunnah. The Imam reciting out loud in a silent prayer, or vice versa. These are actions whose wujub is established by way of the Sunnah. So what is the purpose of Imam Quduri mentioning this very general category as well? This requires a little more research. But nonetheless, the ulama interpreted this in a specific way, and they interpreted it in a way where, again, the reason becomes leaving a wajib. Leaving the Fatiha, the Qunut, the Tashahhud, and the Takbirat of Eid also entails leaving a wajib, because all of these are wajib in the prayer. Same for the Imam reciting out loud in a silent prayer, or vice versa. Regarding the Qunut, Tashahhud, and the Takbirat, do recall the discussion that we had earlier regarding the Tashahhud and the khilaf between the ulama on whether it should be termed a wajib or a sunnah, and how the wujub was understood, and how the wujub of forgetfulness prostration specifically was understood for leaving things like the qunut, the tashahhud, and the takbirat of Eid. And we read the section on this issue from Imam Muhammad's Kitab al-Asr, and we noted that he was reasoning from a very different perspective in terms of how he was framing these acts within the prayer. And so you can go back to previous lessons to refresh your memory on that particular issue. Then Imam Quduri says that the forgetfulness of the Imam necessitates prostration on the follower. Right? سهو الإمام يوجب على المؤتم السجود. فإن لم يسجد الإمام, if the Imam does not prostrate, then the follower does not either. But if the follower forgets, the Imam is not required to prostrate, and nor is the follower. And this returns to the idea that we took, the topic governing principle that we took in the section on the Jama'ah, which is that following or iqtida is building one prayer, tahrima, on the prayer of another. And when you build your tahrima on the tahrima of another, this act of following entails specific things. It entails, as we said, a participation in the same prayer. It entails an ittihad in the same prayer. And another thing it entails is not opposing the Imam in the actions that he does, because this would negate the very concept of following. If the Imam is going into sajda and you're not, then you're not following him. Right? If the Imam is sitting and you decide to go into a sajda, then you are not following him. And so by anchoring your prayer or your tahrima to the prayer of the Imam, this has required specific things on the part of the follower. There's a particular meaning in the word following that is undermined when you perform the forgetfulness prostration because of a mistake you've made, but not your Imam, right? Because it entails that your Imam is not prostrating, but you are. And the other scenario the same reasoning applies. Then he says, ومن سهى عن القاعدة الأولى ثم تذكر وهو إلى حال القعود أقرب عاد فجلس وتشهد وإن كان إلى حال القيام أقرب لم يعد ويسجد للسهو. Whoever forgets the first sitting and then remembers while being closer to sitting, he sits again and performs the tashahhud. If he is closer to the standing position, he does not return to the sitting position but performs the prostration of forgetfulness. Now over here, this is an issue, again, if everyone is paying attention to all the lessons, you see the same principles appearing over and over again. So we took this principle earlier, that when something draws closer to another thing, it takes on its ruling. Right? When did we take this principle? We took this principle when we were discussing the issue of rising from prostration. There's a khilaf between the ulama. To what extent is it obligatory to rise from one prostration in order to go into a second prostration? And we mentioned how some ulama said, all you have to do is make sure your head lifts off the ground, and that's sufficient to fulfill the obligation of rising from the first prostration. Other ulama said, no, you have to be closer to the sitting position than to the position of prostration. And this particular issue relates to the same ideas, the same rationale that was governing and guiding the conclusions of jurists on that issue of rising from prostration, which is that so long as you are closer to the state of sitting than you are to the state of standing, you are deemed to be in the sitting position. Right? And one of the ways to understand this, according to some fuqaha, is based on this principle: when something draws closer to another, it takes on its ruling. But another way they often explain it is that when an onlooker looks at you, when someone is looking at you, at what point does he say you're standing? Is it when you are getting up from the sitting position with your hands are still on the floor, you've started lifting your legs up a little bit? Do they say you're standing now? Or do they say, well, he still seems to be sitting. He's still close to a sitting position. So the ulama, they want a point of demarcation between when can we say an individual is now standing and when can we say he is now sitting, right? And over here, the ulama, what they did was they said if you are closer to one position than the other, then you take on the ruling of being in that position. And so if you're closer to sitting, you're going to be deemed sitting. If you're closer to standing, then you're going to be deemed to be standing, because normally this is how the onlooker will view you, and because there is Shari'i precedent in the ahkam for this particular principle of when something draws closer to another, it takes on its ruling. And so over here, in this case, if you are closer, if you have, you've done your sajda for your second cycle, now you have to sit down and recite the shahud. You forget it, and you start standing up. If you are closer to sitting, you are effectively deemed to be in the sitting position, and so you return to the sitting position and perform the shahud. And no prostration is needed in this case. Why is no prostration needed? Because you are treated as if you have never left the sitting position. Right? You are treated as being effectively in the sitting position. But if you are closer to standing, then effectively you are deemed to be standing, and you have missed the sitting, and therefore you have missed a wajib, and so a prostration is needed to make up for this deficiency. Then he says, وَمَنْ سَهَى عَنْ الْقَاعِدَةِ الْأَخِيرَةِ فَقَامَ إِلَى الْخَامِسَةِ رَجَعَ إِلَى الْقَاعِدَةِ مَا لَمْ يَسْجُدْ فِي الْخَامِسَةِ وَأَلْغَى الْخَامِسَةَ وَيَسْجُدُ لِلسَّهْوِ. Whoever forgets the final sitting and stands for a fifth cycle, he returns to the sitting so long as he has not prostrated for the fifth cycle. He negates the fifth cycle and performs a forgetfulness prostration. So now first Imam Quduri took when you mistakenly stand up from the first sitting without performing the first sitting. Now he is discussing standing up mistakenly from the without performing the final sitting. And so over here the issue becomes a bit different, right? Over here, even if you fully stand up for the fifth cycle, as long as you have not performed a sajda, you should simply go back and sit down and perform your final sitting. And then after that, of course, you perform the forgetfulness prostration because you have delayed the performance of this final rukn. Now, what does this return to? This returns to this idea that a cycle, when we have a cycle of prayer is only deemed complete when one performs prostration in it. Right? A cycle of prayer is only deemed complete when one performs a prostration in it. And so when you have one of the arkan of salah remaining, which is the final sitting, an individual, what you should do is you should basically just return to what you are required to perform. You are not required to stand up for a fifth cycle and complete the fifth cycle. What you're required to do now is you're required to simply perform your final rukn, which is the final sitting, to the extent of the tashahhud. That is what you're required to do. And so you just discard this extra act that you have done and you go straight back into the sitting position in order to perform this final obligatory act. And then the forgetfulness prostration, as we said, is required because you have delayed the performance of a rukn. But what if you actually prostrate for the fifth cycle? What happens then? Imam al-Quduri mentions فَإِنْ قَيَّدَ الْخَامِسَةَ بِسَجْدَةٍ بَطَلَ فَرْضُهُ وَتَحَوَّلَتْ صَلَاتُهُ نَفْلًا وَكَانَ عَلَيْهِ أَنْ يَضُمَّ إِلَيْهِ رَكْعَةً سَادِسَةً. If he secures the fifth cycle with a prostration, his obligatory prayer is invalidated and changes into a supererogatory prayer. He should add a sixth cycle to it. And so remember, this whole scenario is when you have not, over here in this specific situation, this is when you have, what's happened over here? When you have forgotten to sit for the final sitting. So if you forget to sit for the final sitting, your fourth cycle, you do one sajda, you do two sajdas, you stand up, instead of sitting down and reciting tashahhud, you stand straight up. You stand up, you perform a fifth cycle, and you do sajda for that cycle. Here, your obligatory prayer has been invalidated. It has been invalidated. Why has it been invalidated? Well, this is how we reason through this issue. The ulama mentioned that a cycle with one sajda completed effectively counts as a prayer. It effectively counts as you've commenced the prayer. By performing a fifth cycle with a prostration, one has thus commenced a prayer. And what this requires is having exited from the prayer that one was earlier on. So you've prayed 4 cycles, you do 2 sajdas, you get up from those sajdas, you forget to perform your final sitting. You're in your Dhuhr prayer, you forget to perform your final sitting, you get up straight for a fifth cycle without knowing, you prostrate for that fifth cycle. When you prostrate for that fifth cycle, effectively what's happened now is you've commenced a new prayer. You've effectively commenced a new prayer. But in order for you to commence a new prayer, this requires that you have exited from the prayer that you were performing previously. Right? But the prayer that you were performing previously was an obligatory prayer, and you forgot to do one of the obligatory actions required for that prayer, which is the final sitting. And so therefore, that prayer of yours is not considered valid. And it is transformed into a nafil. It's transformed into a nafil prayer. And this is why it is recommended in this case that one add a 6th cycle. Why? Because there's no such thing as a 5-cycled nafil prayer. And so you just add a 6th cycle in order to give it the proper form of a Nawafil prayer. So that's the legal reasoning for that issue. But then he says, in a slightly different scenario, وإن قعد في الرابعة قدر التشهد ثم قام إلى الخامسة ولم يسلم يظنها القاعدة الأولى عاد إلى القعود ما لم يسجد في الخامسة ويسلم ويسجد للسهو. If he sat in the fourth cycle for the extent of the tashahhud, then stood for a fifth cycle without giving the taslim, thinking it was the first sitting, he returns to sitting so long as he has not prostrated in the fifth cycle. He gives the taslim and performs the prostration of forgetfulness. Now over here, how is this scenario different from the one we took previously? Over here now, you have actually sat for the extent of the tashahhud after the fourth cycle. So you've completed the final rukn, the final act that is obligatory upon you within the prayer, which is sitting for the extent of the tashahhud. And now the issue becomes that you have left out a wajib of that prayer, which is to exit it with a taslima, with the salam. Right? You have not exited it with a salam. Rather, what you have done is you have stood up for a fifth cycle, right? And again, if you have not performed a sajda, what do? You go back into the sitting position and just normally give the taslim with a forgetfulness prostration because you have delayed that wajib. But in this case, if you do prostrate for the fifth cycle, وإن قيد الخامسة بسجدة ضم إليها ركعة أخرى وقد تمت صلاته وركعتان له نافلة ويسجد للسهو. If he secures the fifth cycle with a prostration, he adds another cycle to it and his prayer will be complete. The two cycles will be a nafila for him and he performs the forgetfulness prostration. What does this mean? Again, the same reasoning applies. You've prostrated for the fifth, you've effectively initiated or commenced a new prayer. This requires exiting the prayer that you were previously upon. And that prayer was an obligatory prayer, but in this case, you have actually fulfilled all of the arkan and obligatory actions of that prayer because you have sat in the fourth cycle for the extent of the tashahhud, which is the final obligation upon you. The only thing that you have missed is giving the salam to exit the prayer, which is wajib. And so this will not affect the validity of your prayer, but you will still have to perform a forgetfulness prostration at the end because it is leaving a wajib. It is leaving a wajib action. And again, you add a sixth cycle because there's no such thing as a one-cycled supererogatory prayer. And so you add an extra cycle in order to make it two. Right? In order to make it two. So effectively you've prayed, you've joined a four-cycled fard prayer with a two-cycled nafil prayer in this particular scenario. And we've just explained this. And then the last slide. ومن شك في صلاته فلم يدري أثلاث صلى أم أربعا وكان ذلك أول ما عرض له استأنف الصلاة فإن كان الشك يعرض له كثيرا بنى على غالب ظنه وإن كان له ظن فإن لم يكن له ظن بنى على اليقين. And this is fairly straightforward. If someone has a doubt in his prayer, not knowing whether he performed 3 or 4 cycles, and this is the first time this has happened to him, he restarts the prayer. Right? He simply restarts the prayer. It's the first instance, and so you just err on the side of caution and you restart your prayer. But what if it is something that happens to one quite frequently? And then over here, you simply base your decision on your reasonable surety. And reasonable surety over here is not very complicated. It's simply, what you believe is most likely. You're confused whether it's 3 or 4. You're standing in prayer. You're thinking, you're still reciting the Fatiha and everything, but you're thinking, is this my 3rd cycle or my 4th cycle? And you say, you know what? I actually think it's my 3rd cycle. Khalas, that's it. That's your ghalib dhan is right there. And so you just go with that. But if you're completely confused, you have no idea which cycle you're in, then what did you say? Bana al yaqeen. And what's the yaqeen? The yaqeen is the minimal amount. So if you're confused between 3 and 4, then you know for sure that you've at least prayed 3. You know for sure that you've at least prayed the minimal amount. If you're confused whether you're in the 3rd cycle or the 4th cycle, well, over here in this particular example, you would the yaqeen would be, what would the yaqeen be? Would it be 3 or would it be 2? Right? And so you build it on what you're certain of. So even in a confused state, there is sort of a lowest common denominator type of fact that you are certain about, that I'm certain that I've at least prayed 2, right? But I do not know whether what I am on right now is the 4th cycle or the 3rd cycle or whatever it may be. And so in this case, what the ulama prescribe is you go with the minimal number, but then because it's possible that the 3rd cycle is your 4th cycle, you do tashahhud for that 3rd cycle, right? And then you do tashahhud again for the 4th cycle. And then you do a forgetfulness prostration. Why? Because in this case, it is it is certain that you have added a tashahhud in a place where it should not have been. Right? And so that's pretty straightforward. And inshallah, that will end our lesson for today. In our next lesson, we'll be taking the prayer of the sick. And as I mentioned, the prayer of the sick and the prostration of recital, I'll be recording those sessions. And so we'll be starting the chapter that begins after the prostration of recital in our next class. Regarding some questions, the recitation choice exists whether you are praying alone or in jama'ah. Yes, because even the jama'ah, the last 2 cycles of Dhuhr and Asr and Isha, they're silent, and so the Imam still has a choice of whether he wants to recite the Fatiha in those, whether he wants to recite the Tasbihat, whether he wants to remain silent. The ruling does not change whether you are in congregation or whether you are praying alone. Alhamdulillah. So barakallahu fikum for coming. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.